They say time is money, but in this city, time was blood. In the autumn of 1942, statisticians calculated a terrifying number. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier sent to this city was 24 hours. Just one day to live, to fight, and to die. This is not a battle. This is a meat grinder. Welcome to Stalingrad. In the heart of Russia, there is a river that flows like a vein of liquid history, the Volga. To the people who live on its banks, it is not just water. It is Matushka, Mother Volga. For centuries, it has been the lifeline of an empire, carrying grain, timber, and the songs of boatmen down to the Caspian Sea. But in the summer of 1942, the waters of the Volga would no longer reflect the blue sky or the golden sun. They would reflect the twisted skeletons of burning cities, and soon they would run red with the blood of 2 million men. This is not the story about glory. There is no glory in a slaughterhouse. This is the story of the end of the world, contained within the limits of a single city. A city that bore the name of the man who ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist, Stalingrad. Before the first shell fell, Stalingrad was a jewel of industrial ambition. It stretched for 30 miles along the western bank of the river, a city of white apartment blocks, parks filled with laughing children, and massive factories that churned out the tractors for the collective farms. It was a symbol of the new Soviet era, and because it was a symbol, it was doomed. Far to the west, deep within the forests of East Prussia, Adolf Hitler stared at his maps. The German war machine, the Wehrmacht, had conquered Europe. It had crushed Poland, humiliated France, and driven the British into the sea. But in Russia, the giant was still breathing. Hitler needed a kill shot. He needed to tear out the heart of the Soviet economy. He pointed a trembling finger at the map, towards the south, towards the oil fields of the Caucasus, and towards the city on the Volga. The task fell to the 6th Army. They were the pride of the Reich, the conquerors of Paris. 300,000 men, thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and horses, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, a man of meticulous plans, a staff officer who preferred maps to mud. In the early summer of 1942, they began their march across the endless steppe. The Russian landscape is a psychological weapon all its own. To the German soldier, used to the dense towns and ordered fields of Western Europe, the steppe was a nightmare of emptiness. Endless horizons, dust that clogged the engines and coated the lungs. The heat was suffocating. The sun beat down like a hammer. One German soldier wrote in his diary, "We have been walking for weeks. The horizon never changes. We kill, we advance, but the Ivan just retreats into the vastness. It feels like we are marching into a void that is waiting to swallow us." Yet morale was high. Why shouldn't it be? They were the invincible army. They had never known defeat. They believed that one last kick would bring the whole rotten Soviet structure crashing down. They were told they would be home by Christmas. They laughed as they painted slogans on their trucks. To Stalingrad, and next stop, the Volga. But as they pushed deeper into the Don Bend, the resistance began to stiffen. The Soviet retreat was no longer a rout. It was a fighting withdrawal. Stalin had issued Order Number 227, a brutal, simple command that would define the coming battle. Ni shagu nazad. Not one step back. Panic mongers and cowards were to be shot on sight. The Red Army was being forced to stand and die. and the Sixth Army was walking straight into the meat grinder. August 23rd, 1942. It was a Sunday. The sun was shining over Stalingrad. The heat haze shimmered off the asphalt. In the city, life went on with a strange, surreal normality. Factory workers were on their shifts. Mothers were chewing for bread. The war seemed close. Thunder could be heard in the distance, but the city still stood. People believed the river would protect them. They believed the anti-aircraft batteries would protect them. They were wrong. At 4 p.m., a low hum began to vibrate in the air. It grew louder and louder, until the very ground began to shake. The sky to the west turned black, not with clouds, but with metal. The Luftwaffe, General Wolfram von Richthofen, had unleashed the 4th Air Fleet. 600 bombers, Heinkels, Junkers, Stukas. Their mission was not military, it was terror, total annihilation. The sirens began to wail, a mournful, mechanical scream that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. But it was too late to run. The first bombs fell, and then the world ended. High explosive bombs shattered the buildings, turning 6-story apartments into dust in the blink of an eye. Incendiary bombs rained down like glittering confetti, igniting everything they touched. The wooden houses of the workers' districts turned into bonfires. The asphalt on the streets melted, trapping people in a sticky, boiling black river. The massive oil storage tanks on the riverbank were hit. This is the image of hell on earth. Thousands of tons of burning oil spilled out. It flowed down the cliffs and into the Volga. The river itself caught fire. Boats trying to ferry civilians to safety were engulfed in flames as they floated on the burning water. The sky turned purple and black. The smoke rose so high it could be seen from 60 kilometers away. When the sun set on August 23rd, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a lunar landscape of craters and jagged walls. 40,000 civilians lay dead in a single afternoon, more than the entire Blitz on London. The smell was overpowering, the stench of sulfur, burning timber, and roasted flesh. But amidst the horror, something unexpected happened. Something that defied the logic of the German high command. The bombing was supposed to break the Soviet will. It was supposed to make them surrender. Instead, it hardened them. The survivors crawled out of the cellars. They looked at their destroyed homes. They looked at the bodies of their children. And the fear evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, absolute hatred. The bombing had also created a tactical nightmare for the Germans. By destroying the city, the Luftwaffe had created the perfect defensive terrain. Mountains of rubble blocked the streets. Broken walls provided millions of firing positions. The sewers became tunnels for movement. The panzer tanks designed for open fields were now blind giants stumbling into a trap. General Paulus watched the city burn from his headquarters on the steppe. He thought the battle was won. He prepared his troops to march in and conduct a mopping-up operation. He did not know that the ruins were watching him. He did not know that every pile of bricks now held a rifle. He did not know that he was sending his army not into a conquered city, but into a grave. On the east bank of the Volga, General Vasily Chukov took command of the 62nd Army. He was a brutal man for a brutal time. He looked across the river at the burning inferno. He knew that if Stalingrad fell, the Volga would be cut and the Soviet Union would likely collapse. He gathered his officers and gave them a simple choice. "There is no land for us beyond the Volga," he said. We stand here or we die here. Under the cover of darkness, the first reinforcements began to cross. The 13th Guards Rifle Division. Young men. Many of them had never seen combat. They were packed onto ferries, fishing boats, anything that could float. German artillery shelled the river relentlessly. Stukas dived, screaming out of the night sky. Water geysers exploded around the boats. Men were blown into the freezing, oily water. But they kept coming, wave after wave, stepping off the boats and charging straight up the steep riverbanks into the burning city. Many lived only for 24 hours, but their sacrifice bought time. And in Stalingrad, time was paid for in blood. The stage was set. The board was clear. Two totalitarian giants had locked horns in a space no bigger than a few city blocks. The mobile war was over. The war of the rats, the Rattenkrieg, was about to begin. The German High Command had a word for their strategy: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. But in the ruins of Stalingrad, the lightning died. The German soldiers who had swept across nations in weeks found themselves fighting for days just to capture a single kitchen. They called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. September turned into October. The battle lines were no longer drawn on maps by generals in clean uniforms. They were drawn with chalk on the walls of ruined apartments by desperate men. A German lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We have captured the kitchen, but the enemy still holds the living room. We are fighting for the ceiling, while the Russians are shooting at our feet from the cellar." This was intimate violence. Soldiers could hear the enemy breathing on the other side of a wall. They could smell the tobacco smoke of the men they were trying to kill. The sewers became highways of death. German troops would go to sleep in a captured bunker, only to have a Soviet squad pop up from a manhole behind them, knives in the dark. Silence, then nothing. General Chuikov, the Soviet commander, understood this new reality better than anyone. He knew his men were outgunned by German artillery and air power, so he ordered them to hug the enemy. Stay close. So close that the German Luftwaffe could not drop their bombs without killing their own men. He turned the German advantage into a suicide pact. In the center of this madness there stood a building. On the maps, it was just building number 4. But to history, it is known as Pavlov's house. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov was 24 years old. He led a small platoon of stormtroopers to capture this strategic apartment block. They killed the Germans inside. They secured the doors, and they waited. For 58 days, they held it. Think about that. 58 days. The entire country of France had fallen in 46 days, but this one apartment building refused to die. They turned the house into a fortress. They mined the courtyard. They set up machine guns in the basement windows. They punched holes in the walls to move between rooms without exposing themselves. Civilians, women and children, were still living in the cellar, scraping mold off the walls for food, while the battle raged upstairs. General Chuikov later joked that the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they lost taking Paris. On the German maps, the building was simply marked as Festung, fortress, a fortress made of brick and stubborn, suicidal will. While the infantry fought for the rooms, another war was happening in the silence, the war of the snipers. The ruins were a sniper's paradise. Thousands of hiding places, shadows everywhere, and the most feared shadow of all was a shepherd from the Urals, named Vasily Zaitsev. Zaitsev didn't just kill, he hunted. He taught his students to be patient, to be stone. Make one mistake, he told them, and you never make another. The Germans were terrified. To walk upright in Stalingrad was a death sentence. Even fetching water from the Volga meant gambling with your life. A flash of light in a broken window, a crack of a rifle, and a man would drop dead before the sound even reached him. The psychological toll was devastating. German soldiers stopped eating. They stopped sleeping. They felt like they were being watched by the ruins themselves. It wasn't just a battle for territory anymore. It was a battle for sanity. By mid-October, the Germans pushed the Soviets back to the very edge of the river. The final line of defense lay in the north. The industrial giants, the Barricadi gun factory, the tractor plant, the Red October steelworks. These weren't just factories, they were cathedrals of steel, and they became the scene of the most brutal fighting of the entire Second World War. Imagine a battlefield where the ceiling is falling down on you, where the air is thick with the dust of pulverized concrete. German panzers drove right onto the factory floor, firing point-blank at Soviet defenders hiding behind unfinished tractor engines. Men fought with shovels, with crowbars, with their bare hands. The noise was deafening. The screams of the wounded echoed off the metal walls, creating a chorus of absolute horror. On October 14th alone, 3,500 Soviet soldiers died in the tractor plant. But they took the Germans with them. The Sixth Army was bleeding to death. It was losing its best men, its best officers, its very soul in these ruined halls of industry. And then the weather turned. The Russian winter arrived early that year. The temperature dropped. The wind began to howl from the steppe. The Germans were exhausted. They had reached the Volga. They had captured 90% of the city. Hitler declared victory in a speech in Munich. He told the world, "No power on earth will move us from this spot." He was right. They would not move, because they were about to be trapped. While Paulus was staring at the ruins, obsessed with capturing the last few meters of the riverbank, Stalin and his generals were looking at the map. They weren't looking at the city, they were looking at the flanks, the weak, overstretched lines held by Romanian and Italian troops north and south of the city. In the darkness of the snowy steppes, 1,000,000 men were gathering. Thousands of T-34 tanks were warming up their engines. The trap was set. Operation Uranus was about to begin. November 19th, 1942. The temperature on the steppe dropped to -20 degrees. A thick, freezing fog rolled in, blinding the world in a wall of white. Inside the ruins of Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army was still fixated on the Volga. They were obsessed with the last few hundred meters of riverbank. They were like a wolf that had sunk its teeth so deep into its prey that it didn't notice the hunter approaching from behind. For weeks, the Soviet command had been practicing maskirovka, the art of deception. Under the cover of night, and often moving without lights, over 1,000,000 Soviet soldiers, 14,000 heavy guns, and nearly 1,000 tanks had moved into position. They did not gather in front of the Germans in the city. They gathered on the flanks, to the north and to the south, the weak points of the Axis line. These sectors were not held by the elite German Wehrmacht. They were held by the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies. These men were brave, but they were ill-equipped. They had no heavy anti-tank guns. their rifles froze in the cold. They were starving. They had warned the German high command that the Russians were gathering, but their warnings were ignored. Hitler believed the Red Army was dead. He believed they had no reserves left. He was about to learn that the Russian bear was not dead. It was only hibernating, and it had just woken up. At 7:20 a.m., the silence of the steppe was shattered. 3,500 Soviet guns and mortars opened fire simultaneously. The sound was so loud it could be felt in the bones of men 50 miles away. The god of war, as Stalin called his artillery, was speaking. Shells rained down on the Romanian trenches, turning the frozen earth into a churned sea of mud and blood. Then, out of the fog, came the monsters, the T-34 tanks, painted white to match the snow. They looked like ghosts sliding across the ice. The Romanian soldiers fought desperately, but it was a massacre. Their grenades bounced off the sloped armor of the T-34s. Panic set in. The lines broke. Tens of thousands of men threw down their weapons and ran into the endless white void. The flanks had collapsed. The door was kicked open, and through the gap poured the Soviet armored divisions, racing fast, not toward the city, but behind it. The goal of Operation Uranus was simple but ambitious: a double envelopment, 2 massive armored pincers, one from the north, one from the south, racing to meet at a town called Kalach, 40 miles west of Stalingrad. For the German 6th Army inside the city, the news came slowly. Confused radio reports, rumors of breakthroughs. General Paulus was paralyzed. He looked at his maps, but the maps were already wrong. The enemy was moving faster than information could travel. On November 23rd, just 4 days after the attack began, the 2 Soviet pincers met at the bridge in Kalach. Soldiers from the Southwest Front hugged soldiers from the Don Front. They cheered. They fired flares into the sky. They shared vodka. The circle was closed. The trap had snapped shut. Inside the Kessel, the cauldron, were nearly 300,000 men. The 6th Army, elements of the 4th Panzer Army, the remnants of the Romanian forces, thousands of Hiwis, Russian auxiliaries. They were the finest fighting force of the Third Reich, and now they were prisoners in the very city they had conquered. General Paulus knew the situation was critical. He sent a desperate message to Hitler. Army encircled, ammunition running low. Request permission to break out immediately to the southwest. A breakout was their only chance. They still had fuel. They still had the strength to punch through the thin Soviet ring before it hardened, but they had to move now. But from his headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler replied with a single delirious command: "The 6th Army will stay where it is. It is the fortress of Stalingrad. It will be supplied by air. Breakout is forbidden." Hitler was obsessed with the map. He could not accept retreat. He remembered the winter of 1941, where his stand-fast order had saved the army outside Moscow. He thought he could do it again. But this was not Moscow, and the 6th Army was not facing a frontal assault. They were in a cage. And then came the greatest lie of the war. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, stepped forward. He promised Hitler that his air force could supply the trapped army. "We will build an air bridge," he said. "We will deliver 500 tons of supplies a day: fuel, ammunition, food." It was a fantasy. The Luftwaffe did not have enough transport planes. The weather was atrocious. The Soviet anti-aircraft fire was intense. But Hitler chose to believe the lie, and with that belief, he signed the death warrant of 300,000 men. December came. The air bridge was a disaster. Instead of 500 tons a day, the Luftwaffe averaged barely 100 tons. Sometimes they dropped useless supplies, condoms, spices, propaganda leaflets, while the men on the ground were screaming for bread and bullets. Hunger began to stalk the trenches. The daily ration was cut to 400 grams of bread, then 200, then 100. Soldiers boiled the leather of their boots to make soup. They dug up the frozen carcasses of horses that had been dead for weeks. The discipline of the mighty Wehrmacht began to crack. Men stole from each other. Officers committed suicide in their bunkers. Typhus and dysentery spread through the camps. And outside the Kessel, the Soviets were tightening the noose. They were not attacking yet. They were waiting for the cold and the hunger to do the killing for them. Christmas 1942 arrived. In the basements of Stalingrad, German soldiers gathered around small artificial Christmas trees. They sang Silent Night. They wrote letters home that they knew would never be delivered. One soldier drew a picture of the Madonna on the back of a map. It became known as the Fortress Madonna. Underneath he wrote 3 words: light, life, love. But in Stalingrad, there was no light, there was no love, and soon there would be no life. January 8, 1943. The Russian winter was at its peak. The steppe was a frozen white ocean. Inside the Kessel, the cauldron, the men of the 6th Army were shadows of human beings. They were starving. They were freezing. Lice crawled over their bodies in such numbers that the gray uniforms looked like they were moving. But on this morning, silence fell. 3 Soviet officers walked out of the white mist toward the German lines. They carried no weapons, only a white flag and a trumpet. They brought a message from General Rokossovsky to Friedrich Paulus. The terms were generous. Surrender now. Officers keep their swords. Rations will be provided. Medical care for the wounded. It was an offer of life. Paulus radioed Hitler. He begged for permission to accept. But the answer from Berlin was the same cold, delusional madness. Capitulation is out of the question. The 6th Army will hold their positions to the last man and the last round. Paulus obeyed. He rejected the offer, and in doing so, he sentenced his men to 3 more weeks of hell. On January 10th, the Soviet answer came. It was called Operation Koltso, the Ring. 7,000 Soviet guns opened fire at once. The horizon exploded. The Soviet tanks began to squeeze the pocket from all sides. They crushed the starving German infantry in their foxholes. They overran the airfields. The airfield at Potomnik, the frantic heart of the airlift, was captured. This was the death blow. No more planes could land. No more supplies could come in. And worst of all, no more wounded could fly out. Thousands of wounded men were left lying in the snow at the edge of the runway. They watched the last plane take off, disappearing into the gray sky. They knew they had been abandoned. Many of them simply stopped fighting the cold and closed their eyes forever. The pocket shrank. The mighty 6th Army, which had once controlled hundreds of miles, was now compressed into a few ruined districts in the center of Stalingrad. They were back where they started, back in the ruins. January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler coming to power. In the basement of the Univermag department store, General Paulus sat in darkness. The Soviet tanks were right outside the door. A radio message arrived from Berlin. It was not a rescue plan. It was a promotion. Adolf Hitler had promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of General Feldmarschall. Field Marshal. But there was a hidden message in the promotion. In the history of the German military, no field marshal had ever been taken prisoner alive. Hitler was not sending congratulations. He was sending Paulus a pistol. He expected Paulus to commit suicide, to become a martyr for the Reich. Paulus read the message. He looked at his staff officers. He looked at the young soldiers dying of typhus in the corridor. And for the first time, he broke. "I have no intention of shooting myself for that Austrian corporal," he said. The next morning, January 31st, a young Soviet lieutenant kicked open the door of the basement. He found the commander of the 6th Army lying on a cot, unshaven, broken, and defeated. The field marshal surrendered. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the last pockets of resistance in the north of the city laid down their arms. A strange thing happened in Stalingrad. For 163 days, the air had been filled with the sound of explosions, screaming Stukas, and machine gun fire. But at 4 p.m., the guns stopped. Silence, a heavy, absolute silence descended on the Volga. It was over. The survivors crawled out of the cellars. They looked like ghosts. Their eyes were hollow. Their uniforms were rags. They blinked in the winter sun, unable to believe they were still alive. The Battle of Stalingrad was history. But for the German soldiers, the silence of the guns did not bring peace. It brought a new kind of hell. 91,000 men surrendered at Stalingrad. 22 generals. They climbed out of their holes, blinking in the winter sun. They were shadows of men, starving, ridden with lice, freezing. They were lined up in columns that stretched for miles across the white steppe. The March of the Dead began. They walked to the prisoner camps in Beketovka, then to Siberia, then to Central Asia. They walked until the boots fell off their rotting feet. If a man stumbled, he was shot. If a man fell asleep in the snow, he never woke up. Typhus and dysentery swept through the ranks like a scythe. In the first few weeks of captivity alone, tens of thousands died. They died of hunger in a land they had tried to conquer by starvation. Of the 91,000 men who marched into the White Void in 1943, only 5,000 would ever see Germany again. Think about that number. 5,000. An entire generation of fathers, sons, and brothers swallowed by the East. The last of them did not return home until 1955, a full decade after the war had ended. They returned to a country that had already forgotten them. Stalingrad was more than just a battle. It was the hinge of fate. Before Stalingrad, the Nazi war machine seemed invincible. After Stalingrad, it never won another strategic victory. The road to Berlin had opened. But the cost was staggering. Nearly 2 million casualties on both sides. The life expectancy of a soldier was 24 hours. A city of 500,000 people was erased from the map. Today, the city has a new name, Volgograd. It has been rebuilt. Parks have replaced the ruins. Children play where snipers once hunted. A massive statue stands on Mamayev Kurgan Hill. The motherland calls, a stone giant raising a sword to the sky. But the past is never truly gone. Every spring, when the snow melts and the rains come, the earth gives up its dead. Farmers plowing their fields still find them. Rusted helmets, unexploded shells, and bones. German bones. Russian bones, mixed together in the same dirt, united in death, in a way they never were in life. This was Stalingrad, the place where the world held its breath, and the place where history turned into ash.